working through details like tuition and housing and all of those things which are usually a complete disaster. So I think, sorry, it's a bad choice of word, undoubtedly. So I think that part of the activity, and the way Paul Gray sees it is, you know, he thinks that sort of our capacity at Berkeley, and perhaps for each one of the other UC campuses, so roughly 200 students is the level of students that we think we'd be able to take, and exactly how that'll shake out between different departments, graduate, undergraduate, is to be determined. So if you multiply that by 10, that's sort of roughly 2,000 for the state of California, so that's sort of where the numbers come from. And so I think that's pretty rational thinking on his part. Okay, so after this discussion, the question arose as to what could one do to help people put their lives together. And then again, there have been a number of faculty from this campus who have been talking a great deal about what can be done. And the purpose of this town hall meeting is to first start up with a number of faculty who've been taking the lead, who have a great knowledge of the circumstances. And we'll sort of, just to get us thinking, we have a few set point presentations, and the order of the presentations also to accommodate people's teaching schedules is we'll start with Carleen Roberts from the business school, so she'll start with a presentation, followed by Mary Comerio from the School of Architecture, Bob B., Ray Seed. Now Ray Seed will also talk to us, I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder, Ray, but he's going to talk to us about how it's not only is it the right thing to do, but how important it is for us as Californians to really understand the dimensions of what needs to be done. And then after that, we'll have Jack Maley, who runs the Center for Earthquake Engineering. And after that, we will have our two speakers from Merced. Is that okay with you folks, Jeff? Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and then right after that, Nick will come up as moderator, and he'll talk a little bit about how we can organize our response. And then we'll have a sort of a town hall style. There are microphones. Please do use the microphones. The technology is not wonderful, but they can at least hear us, and they can periodically see bits and pieces of us. This camera here gets the audience. They do get all the PowerPoint, so that's okay. And so long as we talk into microphones, they can hear everything that we say. So without further ado, so let me introduce Carleen. Sorry?
That microphone?
Oh, you have microphones here. Here. I think we can pick up on this.
Hi, I'm Carleen Roberts, and I'm on the faculty in the School of Business, and my area of expertise is the design and management of organizations in which errors can lead to catastrophic consequences. So this is kind of right up my alley, although I don't think our team's ever dealt with a catastrophe that's as large as this one, but I would suspect neither of your teams dealt with that kind of catastrophe. And I want to, well, first of all, I want to ask you a question. What do you think is going to happen a year and a half from now when all these students who have been now to the University of Washington, to the University of California at Berkeley, to Harvard, to Columbia, to Cal State Hayward, what happens when they return to Tulane? I think that's a fascinating social problem and one that should be looked at, because they will be carrying with them very different cultures, which is exactly what we see in a larger way in a place like southern Louisiana. So it's exactly the same problem, but it would be micro. I wanted to just begin by saying that this is our sense, and I think everybody's sense now, of the way the problem unfolded. It began as a weather problem, and it quickly moved to an engineering problem, and then it moved to a set of dynamic organizational problems. And that set of organizational problems will be with us at least as long as the rebuilding problems will be, because it will take people a long, long time to take an infrastructure that's been totally destroyed and rebuild it. So just in the simplest way, my students put this together, and this is their idea of a complicated organization. And this is what you're talking about. And on top of it, you have the federal government, you have all the alphabet soup, and at the very bottom of it, you may have families and people who have to work. So this is going to be an enormous social problem. So you go to the next one. Okay, the organizational breakdowns in New Orleans, I didn't do anything very complicated because most of you aren't social scientists. But the organizational breakdowns in New Orleans read like the textbook chapters in an organizational behavior textbook. And that's where I got this list. I went to the textbook I'm using this semester and picked out all the ones I knew were problems in New Orleans. So you have culture, decision-making, communication, at least leadership and negotiation, and probably there'll be spots of motivational problems. You have highly motivated people right now who do not want to leave New Orleans. And they're highly motivated not to do so for a variety of reasons. So these are the simple, down-at-the-earth problems we've studied in many, what we call bread and butter organizations, the usual form of organization, but they're not completely understood in highly dynamic organizations which are trying to operate in a very, very complicated world. And that's what we have in New Orleans. Next one. The macro social breakdowns in New Orleans are a little bit different. They're the political breakdowns, so we need to look at the political issues. I'm glad I'm not a political scientist right now, but in addition to that, there are all the interdependencies that we don't know very much about, even at the basic science level. So we have a wonderful opportunity, I think, here to learn about some of them because they're going to be the very most important things. To my knowledge, there are only 2 papers in the organizational literature on interdependencies and coordination and things that are breaking down. We think about interdependencies as being coordination problems. If I can't coordinate with my husband or wife, I can't get the kids out of the place. So they're within families, within neighborhoods, within community emergency responders, within organizations, and between responding agencies, federal, state, and local. I talked to somebody at LSU day before yesterday who knew that two of the 4 cops who committed suicide. And by the time they got to those cops, they were in exit lines and trying to be safe, and they could not process another piece of information. They simply couldn't do it. And these people really tried to get them out of there, at least 2 of them, and they simply could not do it. People are funny things. So within the organization, between the responding agencies, so there's a myriad of problems that have to be addressed. Some of them we have pretty good research on, but some of them we really don't. So I'm concluding now to give everybody time. It's really the system, stupid. This is a slide my wonderful students made up for me to present to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. You'll be happy to hear that I went through the slides before the presentation. Students always like to drown you, but this would have been a particularly nice time to do it. But it's really the systemic characteristics, and I think that's why we're here with me joining engineers and doing something. And finally, this is what we want to avoid. And this is essentially what happens in organizations, but we really do want to avoid this. Thanks.
My name is Bob B. I'm here at the University of California, obviously, in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. The particular specialty that's tracked me for 52 years now, risk assessment and management. I guess I might joke with you because sometimes I think I need a joke to get me started, particularly talking to an esteemed audience like yourself. My life has been one disaster after another. I've been asked to address 2 key topics for you. Key topic number 1 is where, from this engineer's standpoint, are the key issues that we can help with, particularly as we think about rebuilding and rehabilitation. The second one says, well, what can and should Berkeley do? Linking those 2 things together. Before I sort of get to those answers, and they're very straightforward, I'd like to say to you what I've got to say through a story. My answer starts in 1954. I'm a young engineer working for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the levees and drainage section of South Florida flood control. Kind of bounce along for a while, and then I'll do a fast forward to 1965, September. By this time, I'm now, and I don't quite know how it happened, Chief Civil Offshore Engineer for Shell Oil Company. My location is New Orleans, Louisiana. We get an alert, and the alert is to evacuate. My wife and young son, 4 weeks old, have just returned to New Orleans from Jacksonville, Florida. The reason they did that is I called them in Jacksonville and I said, there is a hurricane, Hurricane Betsy, headed in your direction. And I think it would be in our family's safety for you to fly to New Orleans. So they flew to New Orleans. They landed about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And do you know what the damn storm did? It turned trail and followed the airplane. Okay, so we got them home, got things pretty well secured, and by midnight that night, the wind speeds were gusting well over 140 miles per hour. Buried in my background, I've got meteorology and oceanography, so I'm not watching TV, if you will, or listening to radio to understand. By that time, I'd done some of the pioneering work in wind, wave, current, and surge forecasting in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a very interesting natural phenomenon. We did see the storm coming. You might ask the question why we didn't evacuate. Well, the answer was it was too late. Well, where did we evacuate to? Well, I took the family in the storm to the front of Shell Center, dead center downtown New Orleans. I can remember wrapping our young son up in blankets to protect him from the flying debris. As we drove the car through the streets, I can still see the storefronts sucking out due to the vacuum being caused by the storm winds. Well, they existed under my office table for the next 2 days. We escaped with the clothes on our back, baby food, and formula. Well, by the second day, the storm had gone. The streets were full of debris. We could always tell because you'd hear the police cars driving down the street and their tires were exploding. And that's because they were hitting glass and these sorts of things. So we knew we had to wait a while. But everything was pretty okay. I've been through hurricanes before, raised in the South. And so I thought, well, I've got this secured at the office. I'm, again, kind of reminding you, Shell is a massive empire that produces oil and gas, and that is not interrupted casually. So I said, I got this secured. Now I'm going to go back and try and secure the house. Now our house was out on the northeast quadrant of New Orleans, by the New Orleans airport, next door to something called the Industrial Ship Canal. Well, I got across the Industrial Ship Canal, okay, they got the streets cleared, and I'll never forget the feeling. There were cars parked everywhere. And so I parked the car and climbed to the top of the levee and looked out over the levee, and it had become Lake Pontchartrain's extension. The top of the house was there. I could see it from the top of the levee. There was 12 feet of water there. Well, I had to kind of hang around till the water level dropped a bit, but being trained as a diver and a swimmer, I swam into the house. Came in through the roof. From then on, it's kind of a recovery nightmare. My family lived under my office table for a month. We cooked baby food and warmed black bottles in the coffee maker. And of course, we didn't have a grocery store. At first, I had enough quarters to get the sandwiches and the candy. Afterward, we violated the vending machines. As I see what is unfolding, and has unfolded in this catastrophe, I went through a dress rehearsal for it. A result, we didn't have to worry about help. There wasn't any. There was no FEMA. There was no flood insurance. There wasn't anything. Everything was lost. Libraries, when they get wet, they swell. And you say, oh, I'm going to rescue my books, at least. And the answer is, no, you have to chop them out of the bookcases. So we lost it all. And so back to the office, back to securing that. Family lives under the table. Bob's, meanwhile, trying to bring online the Gulf of Mexico production. I think the way to get to the end of that story pretty quick is it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt with a lot of pain. It was rebuilt with a lot of good people's efforts, and I remember them by name. Now, by the way, I'm getting input since Katrina started to cross the Gulf from about 100 people. You would not like my email. 50 of our students are on site today. They are in the field. They own homes in the immediate area of New Orleans. So these students, I call them colleagues, are feeding back to me the true story. The other 50 represent, I'll call, the residue of my trail that brought me here to Berkeley. Now, I'm going to do another fast forward on you. The fast forward is 1988. I'm over here in the city. I'm a vice president of Bechtel. And kind of maybe because we had just sold our young company to Bechtel, I came over here and was blessed with joining you. Kind of mucked around in this area of risk assessment and management. I'd worked all over the world for Shell on exactly this topic, floods, tsunamis, big earthquakes. I worked on the Anchorage 64 disaster. So I came over here with a disaster behind me, and we mucked around in that disaster for about a year. And one of my students one day uncovered a very, very interesting paper about flight deck operations on a nuclear aircraft carrier. And the author of that paper was Professor Carleen Roberts. As usual, I'm drug around by my graduate students. They're much smarter than I am. So we went over and sat down across the desk from Carleen. And I'll tell you, the most remarkable breakthrough happened in my entire life. The way I explain it to people is for the previous some odd 40 years, I had been working on 10% of the problem. The 90% was tied up in human and organizational factors. Well, Carleen's kind of patient. She learned how to put up with me, kind of like my wife, only, different. She networked me around the world to a marvelous treasure trove of people that became patient with Bob. I was blessed as I came here to become a member of the National Academy of Engineering. I honor my membership in the Academy of Management even more highly. And that's because as an engineer, I kind of borrow things from people. I borrow from physicists and chemists and materials people. That's traditional in what I do. Well, now I'm over and I'm borrowing from social scientists and political scientists to learn as an engineer how to solve the right problems in the right ways at the right time. What are the key issues? I think there's one pivotal key issue. I think that pivotal key issue is reestablishment of the infrastructure systems in the path of Hurricane Katrina. There is no doubt in my mind, and that means I'm probably wrong. All right, and when I use infrastructure systems, I use this in a very, very general way. Infrastructure systems, to me, the first thing that is involved in that definition of something called a system are people and their organizations. I shift to structures, and I shift to all kinds of marvelous hardware like this in this room right now. I shift to environments, those winds, those waves, those currents. Man, I love them. Those internal environments, they're kind of gnarly. There are those, we'll call them cultural environments. Note the culture of New Orleans is an extremely unique culture. I've lived in 11 different countries in my life. I've worked in more than 60 additional countries. Let me tell you, this part of the world is unlike any other that I've been in. I played my accordion for Thanksgiving dinners with Louisiana people. I learned to say kunas and be respectful. I even learned how to suck crawdad heads. This is a unique culture. It's 300 years since we sort of been tracking it. By the way, New Orleans used to be at sea level, and it's been sinking. And while it was sinking, of course, we were reacting. We were building levees and floodways. And it's just continued to sort of grow that way, topsy-turvy. Corps of Engineers coming in and doing all they could. But I guess the clock was ticking. Early warnings from the floods of the Mississippi River. The Corps of Engineers goes in and they do a miraculous job. Note that in Katrina, we didn't get flooding from the river. We got flooding from the lake. And by the way, it came 2 days after the hit. That's a tip. That is a major tip. The other tip I would give you in the offshore industry that I'm still very heavily interfaced with, we started evacuation on the 26th. New Orleans started evacuation on the 30th. In the offshore, we're not bound up by the normal things that you have to deal with. We don't have governments and regulations that are out there. By the way, that's why you haven't seen this in the press. It's kind of hard to get out there. So that we've learned to deal with these kinds of hazards in a very much different way. We're still very sensitive to money and to politics and those kinds of things, the environment and our cultural heritage. But we've had to learn how to deal with it in maybe a more responsive and direct way. Okay. So it's systems and it's infrastructure. Now what should we do? Well, I guess the way to put it is I can't tell you what we should do, but I can tell you what we think we are going to do. We are initiating 3 efforts. And this is not meant to be exclusive. This is not meant to say, hey, we've got everything covered. One of the things I've learned in this disastrous career of mine has been that if you think you know what is happening at ground zero and you haven't been there, you don't know. So I think the first thrust of our work, all 3 proposals, is to go and gather data, to sharpen our perspectives and our understandings, to preserve some of the very, very important things that can be, in fact, and I can speak a lot from history, they get trashed, they get lost. And we think one of the things that we can do, and certainly a theme of CITRIS, is in that preservation. Analysis, meaning understanding and knowing where to go next. The first thrust is onshore. That's for levees and flood protection. And the point lead person is Professor Ray Seed. The second thrust is coastal and offshore. The point person for that is myself. The third thrust is toward humans, social dynamics. And the point person for that is my dear friend, Katrina Roberts. You haven't heard too much about the offshore yet. I try to explain things to my wife, and it helps refine my thinking in so doing. And I told her that you've heard the first slipper drop, kind of like at night when you're taking off your clothes and shoes. And this first salt slipper has dropped, and it's called the catastrophe of New Orleans. Lafayette, it started to show up in the news. I used to live there. Over to Gulfport, I lived there too, all the way over to Biloxi. I know how to speak Alabamian and Mississippian pretty well. So a good way to put it is, that's the salt slipper. The iron boot that's getting ready to drop is the disaster offshore. Today, we've reestablished about 75% of the productive capacity offshore. That is 1/4 of the United States production daily. It's about 2 million equivalent barrels per day that flow in largely through the South infrastructure. We have 33,000 miles of pipelines out there. The biggest damage, as we know it right this minute, is to that pipeline infrastructure. It's not holding pressure. We have more than 50 platforms that kind of joke, I can't find it. The others that we already know are so badly damaged we can't reestablish operations. 2 of those platforms cost more than $2 billion to put in place. One of them handles 10% of the productive capacity of the Gulf through one place. How could we do that? Well, all of you here, all of you at Merced and the rest of our brother institutions, you've got a lot to contribute. I'm in contact with my friends at LSU. I went there. I'm in contact with my friends at Tulane. That's where I learned concrete jack. I'm in contact with my friends at Texas A&M University. Well, you know, Aggies. Contact with my friends at the University of Texas. I used to be on the advisory board there. I'm in contact with my friends at the University of Houston. There is a massive intellectual framework out there, and it's engaged and engaging. And one of the themes of what I think we can do is to help. Not replace, not move aside, not shove aside, but rather to offer assistance. Well, the offshore platform problem started to show up at the gas pump. I had to fill up last night and had a heart attack. This town hall is a step toward getting your input, and that's needed. These initiatives that I spoke to are not the end. They're only the beginning. A couple of thoughts that I'd like to leave you with. I spent a year in the Netherlands, again, working for Royal Dutch Shell. While I was there, one of the first things I love to do is to go to the libraries and to go to the art museums because they seem to give me a snapshot of culture and of history. I learned about their 1953 maximum incredible North Sea flood. I actually knew about it, of course, because I was out in the ocean at that time. And it completely inundated that country. One of the questions that I've got is, well, you know, will New Orleans rebuild? And I kind of sit there and smile because that entire country rebuilt. And it rebuilt without the resources that we have. And it rebuilt using marvelous engineering technology. It is a model. They have defense in depth. If you think you can outwit Mother Nature, you know, keep thinking. Bob hadn't found out how. She seems to have a way to kind of outwit us. And they've learned that. So they have defense in depth, multiple barriers to hold out water. And they know damn good and well the water's going to get through. And at that point, we have to mobilize what? Rescue. Stabilizing systems. They have these things on constant standby, including the police and law enforcement. I think there's a great deal to learn from them. The other thing, I call it three things that I've learned. And this one particularly I'm sensitive to since I was kind of a survivor of Hurricane Betsy. The first one is please don't get in the way. The people on the ground are doing the very best that they can. And that's not saying, you know, get out of the way, don't bother me, I already know what should be done. It's saying to be sympathetic with them, to reinforce them, to support them. And if they're in the wrong direction, kind of put an arm on their shoulder and redirect them. I think the next one is really important, and it almost brings me to tears. Don't criticize nor politicize. Pull together, do not pull apart. I'm watching the media just like you and reading all I can. And I think we're at a stage now where we're starting to pull ourselves apart, and that's not good. It's wasteful in resources. And by the way, I would caution us in the academic regime to remember those same words. These are times to pull together, drop petty fences, and understand that the name of the game is to do what we can to help. The third thing I've learned from, when the dust settles and the water level drops down, sit back and start thinking. Start thinking about what we could do better, what needs to be learned into the future. Now, one of the things that you're going to hear is, well, Katrina, for this set of institutions, is actually a learning platform. It's actually a potential catalyst. And I guess the way I've heard it expressed, both here on campus and in the literature, is FEMA. By the way, after I left Shell, we did work for FEMA, flood prediction. Well, FEMA had what I call a hot list. And this is, I guess, more than 10 years ago now. Number one on the hot list was a terrorist attack on the city of New York. Number two on the hot list was a flooding event in New Orleans. Number three on the hot list is a major catastrophic earthquake in a major metropolitan area called San Francisco. I think there's something to be learned here. Thank you.
Turn that off for a second. My name is Mary Camario. I'm a professor of architecture here at UC Berkeley, and my background is as an architect, but I have been working in the disaster arena for quite a number of years. I have looked at recovery and rebuilding after major disasters, particularly in urban areas, and I did a book called Disaster Hits Home, New Policy for Urban Housing Recovery. As Bob described his experience and his very personal experience with hurricanes, I'm really just going to give you a couple of pieces of information about disasters in other areas. He talked about infrastructure. The other part of the infrastructure of any city is its buildings, its built environment. And obviously you need the infrastructure to work. You need the lights to come on and the phone to ring and the plumbing to work before you can rebuild the buildings. So let's talk a minute about those buildings. 50% of the value of the loss in any major disaster is housing. And that's about 90% of the buildings. So we're talking in America about wood frame structures that have been sitting underwater for quite a while. And if we look at those things, there are a couple of other really important lessons that we can glean from disasters in Kobe, Japan, and in the Northridge earthquake and Hurricane Andrew and other events around the globe in both developed and developing countries. And that is that grand plans to remake the city usually fizzle. And the reason that grand plans fizzle is very straightforward. We have property owners, and they each have an investment in their particular building and their particular piece of property, and they are very interested in that, and they are not interested in wiping the slate clean and starting over. Another important lesson from past disasters is that the public money goes to the public infrastructure. It goes to streets and roads and bridges and support systems for the city. And it goes to government to keep it operating. It goes to schools. It goes to state institutions. It does not go to private citizens. The majority of the funds for private citizens to recover comes from their insurance, their banks, their mothers, their friends, their relatives. They have to make that recovery quite on their own. That was absolutely the case after the Northridge, after actually every disaster, hurricanes, earthquakes across the United States. And the big difference today is that we are much less well insured than we were after our past disasters of the 80s and 90s, in part because the insurance companies have pulled back from disaster insurance, and in part because people don't buy it. You know, they put it off. It's easier to pay for the kids' orthodontist bills than it is to pay for earthquake insurance in California. So the financial portion of rebuilding is really a private sector enterprise. So with those just basic grand, sort of big lessons from past earthquakes, what can we do as academics? Many of us are in a position of giving advice, whether it's to businesses, to oil companies, to federal agencies, to individuals. That is something to organizations. I think the social and political sciences will be there. The public policy folks will be there. Advice giving is something that all of us as academics can be helpful with. But I think there are two other really important things that we have to pay attention to. And I would call them both the targets of opportunity and the targets of need. We are academics and we do research. In engineering, we are doing the cutting edge technical work, whether it's in geotechnical engineering, whether it's in structural engineering, whether it's in sensors and monitoring in electrical engineering. We bring that technical knowledge to the world and we offer it for the changes that are going to be forthcoming as people rebuild. They're going to be interested in that new technology, and our research is important to that effort. But there is also another layer of research, whether it's in construction technologies, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in social science, whether it's in design and urban planning. those pieces are also part of what we can do. And Bob described 3 efforts. I think there are opportunities for a number of other research efforts that we can push forward. I've been working closely with Jack Maley in the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. He'll talk about that a little more, but we think our experience in that research is applicable not only to New Orleans, but to the Bay Area, and to the kinds of questions we're all starting to get asked, like what does this mean for us here in the Bay Area? But secondly, I think there are targets of need. And the issue there is that we've seen the evacuees, we've seen the poor and the disenfranchised on our TV screens. It's not just the poorest of the poor. It's the teachers and the social workers and the policemen and the janitorial workers and the waiters and the waitresses. We're going to need to develop public policy. We're going to need government programs. We're going to need ways of coping with the rebuilding for those folks who don't have the insurance and who don't have the investment opportunities and who don't have the values that they can, the bland values that they can go back to. And in that sense, I think it is up to us as academics to identify those targets of need and to think about the kinds of programs and the kinds of efforts that will be needed in the decades to come, because we're really talking about issues that apply not only to New Orleans but to the rest of the nation. And in that sense, I think I'll conclude there because we want to hear ideas from everyone, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
My job is to be the other shoe dropping, and in part to answer the question, what does it mean for us here in California? But our perspective is bigger than that. Many of the people in the room here, and in fact many of the people on the project team, do earthquakes for a living. We respond as part of U.S. teams to major earthquakes, and many of us have seen disasters bigger than this. Just in the last 6 or 7 years, we lost 30 to 40,000 people in Turkey and in India each. And New Orleans is the worst disaster we've had since 1906 in America, but these are not new to us. There's something you get in terms of perspective from responding to these events. Our teams have to get in very quickly before rescue operations and the beginnings of cleanup operations obscure the vital data we're looking for. And there's something about the smell of decomposing bodies that changes you forever as an engineer and as a person. And we carry that with us in everything we do. Most of us are here because we specialize in essentially trying to prevent and then also mitigate and respond after these kinds of disasters. The biggest looming disaster that I'm aware of actually exists here on the West Coast, right here in California. New Orleans was not a surprise to anybody that I knew. We had all known for a long time that that would eventually happen. The annual probability was low. About every 200 years or so, a large enough hurricane would hit close enough to New Orleans that we would essentially breach the levees and flood the bowl. And in every given year, that was never quite urgent enough to trigger the large investments necessary to make that a safe situation. So they fixed the levees for lower levels of hurricanes, they made them statically stable, and the risk persisted like a ticking time bomb. We have the same situation here in California in our Sacramento Delta with 1,100 miles of levees, many times more than they have in New Orleans, and unfortunately the population at risk is also many times higher. People don't understand that, not socially and not politically, because there aren't millions of people living in the Delta. That's not the issue. So I'd like to walk you through how that all works. Oh, okay, I'll have to go up there. Oh, this is going to challenge me. The issue in the Delta is the potential not for a catastrophic hurricane, nor even for the breaches and flooding we get periodically in bad years of high water. The issue is an earthquake. And an earthquake and a hurricane have very strong similarities. The likelihood of an earthquake taking out our Delta is roughly the same as in New Orleans. It's about every couple hundred years. And as a result, it hasn't yet triggered enough urgent interest to begin to really dig in and fix the problem. The issue in the earthquake is something called soil liquefaction, so I want to just take a second and show you how that works. This is the city of Turnagain Heights as it appeared from an airplane, oblique aerial view, just before the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964. Sorry. Back up one. This is the same photograph taken from the same angle and same altitude immediately after the earthquake. It doesn't look like the same place, and it's hard to imagine that it is, so I wanted to have the pointer. The next slide I'm going to show you is the 3 small white dots in this area right here. It's a zoom-in view of just those 3 dots, so you get a sense of what you're looking at. And what you're looking at there is a major disaster. This was a complete loss of strength of the ground. It essentially became fluidized for a while, and it was unstable. Half of Turnagain Heights slid off into the ocean. The rest of it was not a very happy place. This is not something you rebuild quickly. This happens in all the major earthquakes. It's a leading cause of damage in many earthquakes, and it's something we're very good at here. It's the issue in the delta for a delta earthquake. It breaks pipelines. Pipeline breaks lead to fires that we can't fight. These last 2 photographs are from Northridge, where we had 12 homes burned right here. In Kobe, we lost 14 city blocks, but they were able to extinguish the fires because they had buried cisterns and diesel-driven fuel pumps that could essentially fight the fire, and they got it out even though there was no municipal water supply with which to do that. We have some local interest in that because, of course, in 1906, the city was destroyed. Most people think the city was destroyed by an earthquake. The city of San Francisco was destroyed by the fire that followed the earthquake, and the fire that followed the earthquake was unextinguishable because there was no water with which to extinguish it. It was finally stopped right here at the edge. This is the edge of the fire break. The fire break was created by blasting with dynamite to destroy 2 city blocks around the full perimeter of the fire. The homes in the background are tilting like they are, not because they failed structurally, but because the foundations have liquefied and they've sunk into the ground and they've tilted. This is a very unhappy neighborhood. Which brings us to Delta's levees. There have been studies of this. The Delta is a ticking time bomb. It's been ticking for 140 years. It ticks louder with each passing year because it's subsiding. Like New Orleans, there was a time, roughly 140 years ago, when it was a sea level marsh. Now the western Delta has sunk over 20 feet below sea level, and what were once small levees are very large ones. The particular risk analysis study that's most authoritative was done in the late 90s. This is a presentation from that. It's excerpts from that presentation. Dr. Les Harder from the Department of Water Resources was the co-chair of the effort to do this. The project team involved a number of levee district engineers who worked privately for most of the reclamation districts and individual islands and tracts across the Delta. It included the top engineers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. It involved the top state engineers from California Department of Water Resources. It was not only the first authoritative study, but people fight like cats and dogs over the Delta. Everybody wants the Delta's precious fresh water supply, and all the environmentalists want the environment to be improved. This study came out, and the results were judged to be non-controversial. All the interest groups bought into the results here. 2/3 of California's precious fresh water, every time I touch it, it goes the wrong way. 2/3 of California's precious fresh water lands in the Sierra Nevada mountains to the east of the Delta. It comes down through the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, and it flows out through the Delta, this area over here, into San Francisco Bay. The Delta region was, in 1860, a sea level marsh. It was diked and created, a series of 60 islands and tracts were created. The river channels were constrained, and because they were constrained and because they flow with some velocity, we have fresh water in the Delta. So 2/3 of the state's very fragile and very precious fresh water supply passes out through the Delta region into the bay. The islands began to sink. The levees were raised and elevated every year. They constantly sink and crack and crumble, and we constantly raise them every year. Every spring, a massive and largely unpublicized fight is waged by the Department of Water Resources and by the federal U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They save numerous levees. They prevent multiple levee breaks, and every now and then we lose one. Sometimes in a really bad year we lose several. And we do a marvelous job of patching them and repairing them on an emergency basis. Not to preserve the lives of people who live on the islands, because there aren't many. We do it to save California's water supply, and that's the issue. 2/3 of our water lands east of the valley. 2/3 of our population lives in the south. We take water from the Delta. The rivers pass the water into the Delta. We extract water at the south end of the Delta, put it in large canals, and we send it to Southern California, and it keeps them alive. There is less than 1 year's worth of emergency storage available south of the Delta. In a major catastrophic earthquake, if we damage the Delta system so severely that we cannot resume service within a year, we will have a largest population in the history of the United States with no access to fresh water. We're evacuating people from the New Orleans area now. Not so much because their homes are underwater, because in about 30 to 50 days the water will be pumped down. We're evacuating them because there is no potable fresh water for them to drink. If we have 18 million Californians with no water, we will not be able in a calendar year to establish new supply systems and bring water in, and we will have to move them out to where they can get water. And in some of the scenarios, we're talking about 2 years and more. People think that the fault system of the Bay Area over here will shake the Bay Area, but the deltas to the east, as you can see, the biggest fault, San Andreas, and the next ones, Hayward, Rogers Creek, and Calaveras, are in fact to the west of the delta, but they can shake the delta, and there are smaller systems moving progressively closer in. This has been studied by lots of people. The delta does consist of 60 islands and tracts. The colored zones are regions which are significantly below sea level. There are 1,100 miles of levees. Every 100 feet, the situation is different. The foundation soils are atrocious. Organic and compressible peats. It all sinks and settles. It's not very stable statically. And more importantly, liquefiable sands and silts, which in an earthquake will essentially turn to fluid and lead to massive cracking and damages. Levees are very complex. Most of the levees in the delta were not engineered at all until about the last several decades, and the engineered portions are built on top of crumbling and non-engineered lower sections. We've seen this kind of thing happen. This is a typical static levee break. Once the breach occurs, it tends to erode rapidly. Within a day, we can have breaks which are hundreds and sometimes 1,000 feet wide or more. Scour holes can be 100 and 150 feet deep in the first few hours, and they can extend 8 football fields inboard. Seismic damage to levees is not a new idea. Evaluating how this stuff works is a function of getting a sense of the probability of strong shaking occurring and magnitudes and similar. That's a problem we've solved. We know a lot about that. Probabilistic risk analyses have been done. Levee fragility is something we're able to assess. We've done an awful lot of work. We're very good at soil liquefaction. Most of that work has historically been applied to dams. We're now doing it in California by a new law established in 1991. Before that, we hadn't done much, but we're now doing it for buildings, schools and hospitals. California's buildings are now required to be seismically safe with regard to the embankment turning to fluid and dropping you and tipping you over. This is a big step forward. Buildings get dropped and tipped and they fall over. Bad things happen. We've had lots of levee breaks. We've had lots of levee breaks to learn from in history. This is an embankment in 1940 down my Santa Cruz area, spread wide open. This is an embankment for our Loma Prieta earthquake, also down in the Santa Cruz area. Failed and spread from liquefaction during the Loma Prieta earthquake. This is an embankment which failed and spread and had a number of places where it would have overtopped had there been a high tide during the earthquake in Kobe. This is another one from Japan earthquake. It happened a few years later in the Yogan Hayan-Kubu earthquake. As you can see, the damage to levees can be rather catastrophic. This was not designed to look this way. This is a very massively damaged levee. And this is a cross-section of that same photograph to give you a sense of the kinds of damage and the kinds of movement we're talking about. If you turn your foundation to a soup, bad things happen to things that rest upon them and require to rest upon them for stability. As best we can determine, looking at the levee system, and the pencil got pretty sharp on this one, roughly, these are the odds of having failures of the levees due to earthquakes. And the number to keep an eye on here is about a dozen. As best we can estimate right now, our capability for response is we could fix a dozen significant breaks with corollary nearby damage and non-breaks in a calendar year. Anytime this number gets over a dozen, we're talking about a water outage which is unsustainable for California's major Southern California populations. The odds of that are, as best we can estimate it, roughly every 200 years we'll get one, but it could be 100 to several hundred. Same odds as New Orleans. And notice that the curve continues to go up into many dozens of breaks. What can we do? We can improve our response capability so we can fix more breaks faster. We can stockpile materials to armor the inboard faces and stop them from eroding. We can simply put rolls of plastic sheets and empty sandbags into a hut on each island, get people out there from the military, and make the levees more fixable by stopping the erosion of the waves as they come through. We can armor the delta. We can take islands out of service. The westernmost islands in the delta have been purchased, Sherman Island and Twitchell Island next door, by the Department of Water Resources. They can be taken out of service as farmland and turned back into something else. We could be disposing dredge spoils from the ports of San Francisco and Oakland on Sherman Island and fill it up above sea level, and then it would not suck water in when it fails and salinate the delta. And that's the issue. The issue is that when the levees fail, the fast-flowing stream channels become essentially stagnant and salt intrudes, and once we saltify the delta, we cease to be able to provide 2/3 of California's water to 2/3 of its population. We're proposing a Center for the Reduction of Catastrophic Research as a UC effort. Sorry, catastrophic risk. Catastrophic research is probably a good food. We like to prevent both. We can't stop catastrophic research, but we think we might be able to stop some of the catastrophic risk. And California's delta levees will be one of the first focuses of that leg of the program. This is the other shoe dropping, the what can we do next kind of stuff. One thing we can learn from New Orleans, and it is being learned at many levels right now in the government, and then it will be quickly forgotten again, as it always is that if you have a low annual probability but highly catastrophic risk, and every year you do nothing, eventually you will have a full-blown catastrophe. Our hope is to be able to prevent that in this instance and in others. Thank you.